Hey, folks, welcome to social psychology. I wanted to start with talking about what exactly social psychology is, some of the history of it, some of the topics that we've historically studied in social psychology, and the current topics that are being explored by social psychologists. Um, I'll introduce myself since this is the first formal lecture. My name is Dr. Travis Clark. I have a PhD in experimental psychology from the University of North Dakota. UND, like many schools, has an experimental psychology program where I learned a little bit about social psych and a lot of other fields of psychology. Social psychology was my specialty, really. Um, and UND also has a master's in forensic psychology program and a clinical psychology program. So I'm an experimental psychologist. I mainly teach, but I also do some research. So that's the kind of psychologist that I am. And when I do research, it's kind of in the methods that social psychologists use or social psychology itself. Anyway, what got me interested in social psychology was the interesting experimental design I learned about in my social psych class as an undergrad. I had some interest in becoming a psychologist before that, but learning about really neat experimental designs, that's what got me into psychology for sure. So let's get into it. What exactly is social psychology? Well, it's the branch of the study of behavior that looks at how your behavior, cognitions, and emotions are changed by your social environment. Your environment is a word I'm going to use a lot. It means the stuff around you that your body can perceive. Um, my physical environment right now includes a computer. It includes, I'm actually in a room. Obviously, that's a Zoom background. I'm not outside of Columbia Hall right now. So my physical environment is all the things I'm interacting with. The social environment is all the people I'm interacting with. Right now, my social environment is, no one. I'm in a room by myself recording this. But if I was around other people, just the presence of those people would change how I see the world, how I interact with the world. And you're constantly, when you're around other people, being influenced by them and influencing them in turn. I like to say that the very first thing that humans do is social manipulation, because as soon as you're born, you usually, most people, they scream or cry as soon as they're born. That is an indication of I'm here, I'm alive, I need attention. It's your very first practice is social manipulation, and you've been doing it ever since then. It's just a social influence is a normal part of interacting with others. So, social psychology is the study of all these processes, how you change when you're in a social environment. Now, social psychology has been a part of psychology for a long time. Historians don't all agree on what should be the actual start of social psychology, but the most common agreed upon start is experiments done by Norman Triplett in the 1880s. He was measuring the speed at which cyclists could complete a race. So he was using a stopwatch to measure how fast they were going. And he found that when he competed cyclists against each other, their speeds were consistently faster than when he had them racing just against the clock. In other words, when you change the social environment by having people race against each other, their behavior changed. Um, Others think that Max Ringelmann, he was an engineer who did some experiments on group effort in the 1880s, was the first social psychologist or started social psychology, but he did his work around the same time as Triplett, but it was published afterwards. Um, Triplett himself thought that he referenced other projects that were going on at the time that arguably were the real beginning of social psychology, because he was referencing them in his studies on cycling. But as we recognize it today, maybe Triplett's was the first published study. Social psychology was not separate from the discipline of psychology until a few years later. A few textbooks published in the 1900s, like the early 1900s, identified a common set of experiments, of which Triplett and Ringelmann's experiments were part of, that kind of comprise this area of social psychology. And then people started studying specifically social psychology like into the 1920s and beyond. So speaking of that, I'm kind of going to skip to some famous studies. A few years later in the 1940s and 50s, we have Kurt Lewin and Leon Festinger. Their research informed a lot of things that we're going to talk about throughout the class. One of those is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a theory that explains some observations about our behavior. Cognitive dissonance itself is when you have two competing ideas in your brain at the same time. So the ideas in your brain, that's where cognitive comes in, and the fact that they're competing against each other, that causes dissonance or distress. So cognitive dissonance is when, like for example, I think I'm a good person, but I mess up every once in a while and I hurt somebody's feelings. I have two competing ideas in my head. One is I'm a good person. Two is I hurt someone. So cognitive dissonance is created because I don't like thinking those two things at the same time. How can I be a good person if I also hurt someone? So what we might do is try to reduce our cognitive dissonance by, in this case, maybe I think I'm not such a great person. Or I can reduce my cognitive dissonance by thinking I am a great person. It's their fault for being offended and getting their feelings hurt, right? In this kind of example, neither one of those is really that much healthier than the other. But cognitive dissonance predicts some real world behaviors that the stakes are a lot higher than what I'm identifying here. Another thing to come from, it's often attributed to Kurt Lewin, is this equation that behavior is a function of a person and their environment. What does it mean for behavior to be a function of the person and their environment? What Lewin pointed out and has become a cornerstone of social psychology ever since then is that anytime you analyze behavior, it doesn't happen without context. Always, when someone or an animal or anything chooses to engage in a behavior, you have to take into consideration the person variables and the environment variables. So I choose to be giving a lecture right now. Well, there are person variables that are motivating me to do a lecture. I like giving lectures. I have a job in psychology that I just intrinsically enjoy. But also environmental factors promote me to do the lecture right now, because I wouldn't be able to do this lecture if I didn't have a computer set up to do it on. There are external contingencies. I don't get paid if I don't do my job, so I'm motivated to do my job. Anytime you consider someone's behavior, it's a combination of person variables and environment variables that allow that behavior to happen or don't allow a behavior to happen. We'll talk about more examples throughout the entire class. Some more famous studies you might have heard of, Muzaffar Sharif and Solomon Asch are doing group conformity studies in the middle of the 1900s. The Solomon group conformity line judgment task is something we'll talk about later in class. Stanley Milgram's famous experiments on shock and social influence, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison study, which we'll talk about later. Other psychologists were studying helping behavior. So what personality traits and what environmental influences lead someone to be more likely to help others. It turns out no matter how altruistic you are as a person, if you are in a hurry, you're less likely to help other people. It's a rare person that is immune to that. So some people are just so helpful that they are immune to the influence of being in a hurry. But for most people, that makes you a little bit less helpful. And of course, there's some people at the opposite end of the spectrum that are not helpful under any circumstances. They're just selfish people. So it's whether you're helpful or not is a mixture of your environment, like are you in a hurry or not? Is there time pressure on you? And person variables. How helpful of a person are you? Right? So again, they're using Lewin's equation to do their research, and a lot of the research in this class is directly using that framework. I wanted to highlight some real world influences that psychology was having on legal issues and cultural issues by highlighting that the psychologists, Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark, were integral to the Brown versus Board of Education legal decision. So psychology is still to this day kind of having an influence on cultural events and legal decisions, as the science of human behavior is directly relevant to these issues. We'll talk about them more in class. There wasn't really a radical shift in the 1970s and beyond, but there were a few changes that happened. One is that many of those experiments that I talked about on the previous slide had ethical issues that not only brought the ethical nature of the experiments into question, but also there were some issues of the scientific integrity of those studies. Some years I choose not to teach the Stanford prison experiment, even though it's a famous demonstration in psychology. I don't like to call it an experiment. I like to call it a demonstration. There were some major ethical issues with the Stanford prison study. So the APA, the American Psychology Association, is now enforcing their own ethical standards that all research must follow. And another big change in the 1980s was cognitive research fell out of favor in psychology around the time that behaviorism became so popular. And for a couple decades, cognitive psychology research was really looked down upon in a lot of psychology, especially American psychology. But it rose back to prominence in the 1980s. Social psychology benefited from this change with the rise of social cognitive research. And many of those famous social cognitive researchers, some that I've got listed on the slide here, are still today the experts in this area that we'll discuss in class. One issue with social psychology up until this point is, although it has some roots in Europe, social psychology really took off in America and in North America in general, but also the United States in particular. And the majority of social psychologists either were trained in the United States or were from the United States. This trend started to change in the 1990s. Many people doing social psych research and many of the studies cited in your textbook are weird. And of course, you'll learn later in class that weird refers to Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures. So if you are trained in a weird culture and you are from a weird culture, and then you're doing research on other people from a Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic culture, your research is going to be biased to explain the behavior of weird people, not humans in general, right? A lot of humans are from North America, but there's other continents, right? There's other countries besides the United States. So one of the remaining ethical issues that we'll talk about this semester is the fact that a lot of the social psych research applies really well to people from North America, but we're starting to discover some of it doesn't apply very well to people from other parts of the world. I want to talk for a minute now about what are some current research topics in social psychology. And these are not all of the research topics that are being studied. There's too many for me to list on this slide. These are just a few of the ones that I like to read about. One of these, I obviously like to read about it. It's got my name on it. Diverging perceptions of personal moral values and the values of one's religious group. That's my latest publication on moral psychology. Moral psychology has been really growing in the last 10, 15 years in particular, and is now a huge area of study in social psychology. Another area is social judgment, and another very exciting area for me is behavioral genetics. Go back 30 years ago to the 90s, people are suspecting that certain genes have influence on certain social behaviors, but we don't have technologies that are cost effective to do any kind of genetic analysis and connect that to social behaviors. Well, the technology has progressed. So nowadays, we actually are able to do that. We're able to, in some cases, tie particular genes to certain personality traits or certain behavioral tendencies. This is all very tentative right now. Some of the research hasn't held up over time. I've got a citation here on the slide if you want to look up some of the studies that have been shown to be reliable. So that's where we're going to stop this first introductory video. And I want to encourage you, there's going to be several shorter videos this week. Take a break, get yourself a drink of water, get prepared, and then make sure you write down these tools of social psychology you're going to see this week.